So as we go into our passage of Mark, we're going to continue on this week in chapter 4. We've done a couple in the early chapters, and now we're in our fourth week. And as we go into continue on in chapter 4, up until this point, Jesus has been reading a lot of parables, and we get into an interesting story today. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about an incident that happened a number of years ago, and it's a story about a researcher. Now, this researcher or scientist, the PhD at all, about 1 billion letters after his name, very smart, very young but ambitious and just brilliant young researcher. And he was working on a specific project. His particular specialty worked with, among other things, electricity and lasers and all sorts of high, crazy, sort of hard for us normal human beings to understand. But he had all over his lab, he had these, have you ever had a point where you had a spark jump from your hand to a doorknob or something like that? Well, he had something like that, but it was like 1,000 times. It was a mega spark jumper, and it would jump across there. And he had all sorts of computer equipment to be able to do his research and testing over here in the lab. And he had all sorts of other electrical equipments and wires going everywhere and so forth. And one day he was sitting there working, and he was getting ready to kind of think about going home, and he had a wife and some young kids, and he was kind of getting ready, and right then he hears this drip, 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 and he's like, what's going on? Well, water started running down the wall, right over by the door, and it was a little ways from him, and he sees the water running down there. He's like, what in the world? He looks at the water, he starts to walk towards it. All of a sudden, he realizes the water has started to envelop some of the electrical things, and so he's left some things on the ground, and so all of a sudden, he realizes that water is dangerous. Now, has anybody here had an incident like that or know of somebody? If electricity is in the water, that's why I tell you not to go near power lines, especially when it's raining, but any time is not a good idea. It can conduct right through the water. So all of a sudden he realizes this water is deadly. I need to stay away from it. I could become electrocuted. Or even if you thought, well, if I ran across there, no, because once he steps in that water, it's going to lock up my muscles, and I would be killed in this water. And the water keeps coming in. So he says, does the only thing he does, the only thing he can do. And he goes over and he jumps on top of a cabinet, because by now there's like a couple inches of water, because the water's coming in faster than it can go out from underneath the crack in the bottom of the door. So the water keeps coming in. He hops on a cabinet. He realizes that cabinet's made of metal. This is not a good thing. So that conducts it even better. So he says, so he works his way over into the corner. He gets on top of a wooden desk, so he's at least safe for a little while. And his desk is about yay high, and the water keeps rising. What was a few inches is now 6 inches, and then a foot, and then a foot and a half. And he's yelling and shouting for help, but nobody seems to hear him. He's in a kind of a soundproof sort of lab, and he's yelling, and nobody seems to be coming to try and save him. So the water keeps rising up, and he suddenly comes to the realization, I don't think I'm going to make it through this. That water keeps coming up, and he's seeing the sparks fly all over, and the computers are dying, and all these things. The electricity is all up above the outlets now, and he's thinking, this is not good. So as he's yelling and yelling, the water gets higher. He looks over at his desk, and there's a picture of his wife and his young kids, and he starts to think, you know what, I'm not going to make this. I'm not going to make it through this. So the water gets higher and higher, and he gets to the point where he tries to get out the different ways. There's no way out. He's stuck. And so he's yelling, and just as he thinks the water's about to come up there, he hears this giant right over by the door. And right then, something happens, and I'll tell you what happens in a little bit. But I want to tell this story because I want to give you a sense of the scariness of the situation, a sense of that these disciples that we're going to read about were genuinely scared. And it's easy for us to look back and know how the story ends and not realize how they were. So today's passage provides a scary situation, and we're going to go through that really quickly. Let me read through the passage. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. If I forget to finish that story, you have the right to say, story, at the end. I've done that before. All right, so Mark 4, 35 to 41. That day when evening came, he, Jesus, said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So we have in this passage, and this is a picture of the Sea of Galilee, sometimes called the Sea of Gennesaret, because there's a city called Gennesaret right next to it. And I'll show you another picture in just a minute. But the idea is there's a Sea of Galilee, and there's this, the Jordan River goes up and down from there. And basically, when they say, "I'm going to go to the other side," there's kind of an imaginary line of that river. They mean going to the other side there. But they're going to go across this sea. Now, from a point of view, from a California point of view, this is not a sea. It's a big lake. It's a big lake, and it has a certain amount of depth to it. But I want to give you a sense of of the danger as they go out into this lake, because coming from Michigan, we have Great Lakes around us, and the waters are just littered with shipwrecks. Because the wind and the waves, when they pull up on a big lake, those wind and waves are really bad, just like they are on the ocean. The ocean is much, much bigger, much, much deeper, and so. But you're going to drown in that much water just as easily as you're going to drown in deep, deep water. And so the waves that come up on this lake can be very treacherous. And as if you've ever had anything with one moment the weather seems like something, all of a sudden the Santa Ana winds are coming in, or something's coming in very quickly. Well, when you're in a boat in the middle of the water and none of you are really all that great swimmers, that's a scary thing. In fact, the word abyss, by the way, refers not only to the pits of hell, but also the depths of the water. It was a scary, scary thing. Abussos is that word where it comes from. But it was a scary thing to them. But they're not scared when they set out. Why are they not scared? Well, they set out in the boat, and they've actually found a boat recently. Did you guys see that when you were over in Jerusalem, that boat? Yeah, they found a boat that is actually from Jesus' time. It's probably not the same boat he was in. I don't think that's not the point. But they found a boat, but it gave them a really good example. And the boat is maybe from here to the Oregon or so, about that long or so. It's about 26 feet long. I haven't seen it in person myself, but it's a long boat. And it gives us a sense of the sort of boat they would be in. It might hold about 10 people, depending on how much cargo you have, maybe about a ton of cargo. But it's a good-sized boat. It's not just a little dinghy. It's not just a little rowboat. But it's also not some sort of gigantic yacht that can really be able to handle heavy winds and seas, because they didn't go out when it was really bad weather. Well, when they set out, it's not really bad weather, because they go out at night. At night, it's many fewer times to have bad weather at night on this particular lake, because bad weather on this lake comes from the way that winds head down. And so I have actually a slide that somebody put together. I didn't put this together, but it's slides that kind of show how the winds come across, and they whip through these canyons. And so there's tall cliffs, not cliffs per se, but tall, kind of like what we have out here with the mountains, very steep sort of situation that the winds can all of a sudden end up funneling down, as we can understand that with canyons here too, the Santa Ana winds. And the winds funnel down, but when the winds grab hold of that lake, they really can toss and turn boats. So they're out on this water, and imagine it from their point of view. They're in this boat going across the water, and all of a sudden, this huge windstorm comes upon them, and they don't know what to do. And they're scared, and some of these guys are fishermen. They've been out on the water. They know these sorts of things. They know that this is something to be scared of. And this wind comes up and it starts beating at them, and the water's coming down, and they're getting soaked to the bone, and perhaps it's cold. I don't know if it's cold enough, but it's bad weather. I don't know if there's lightning or not, but they are scared. They think they're going to die because the boat's in danger of being swamped, which means once it's swamped, that boat is going down, and then they're without anything. So as this water keeps beating down, the sound is probably just deafening. It's scary. Their hearts are beating. They're amidst fear. They're scared of whether they'll live through this. And meanwhile, here's Jesus. Jesus in the stern. He's in the back of the boat, and he's sleeping on a cushion. He's sleeping on a cushion. Now, probably cushion, it was probably cushion-esque. It was more of like probably a sand ballast of some sort that was used in boats like that. But he was asleep on this cushion. You're like, how could he be asleep on that cushion? It reminds you very much of the story of Jonah, where they go down and he's just asleep. But Jesus is asleep, and they go down there, and they're like, Master, how can you be sleeping? You know, I just imagine that sort of thing, that the disciples are going down there like, hey, Jesus, death, mayhem, water, swamp, this is all happening right now while you're sleeping. I hope you're having a good dream, but I hope that your dream can help us out of this sort of situation because we're in trouble. Now, one thing we should know is when they go to Jesus, I really think there's a sense that we bring that shouldn't be in there. We bring with them a sense that they're going to Jesus to ask him to help them get out of this situation. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think they're going to Jesus. They're grasping at anything they can do. They're going to Jesus saying, how can you not be scared? How can you just sleep there? What's going on? How can you do that? Because they don't know how this story ends. They've seen Jesus do healings. They've seen him cast out demons. But this is different. This is nature. This is the storm. Nature oftentimes takes on a persona. That's why it's called a furious storm. By the way, the words that we read there, it's called a mega storm, a great storm. And after Jesus speaks, something else happens. It becomes a mega calm. So Jesus gets up there, and the rain is beating down, and everybody's getting wet. And Jesus, maybe he holds up his hands. I don't know, but he gets up there, and he says, hush, stop, be quiet. Cut it out. And instantly, in a moment, the waves die down. The water stops. The wind stops. Everything is just placid and still. And it's not just, the Bible doesn't give the sense that, right after he said that, the winds cut it out, and then, like within a half hour, the waves really died down. It said, no, instantly, Jesus spoke. The words came out, and as if he was in control of everything, all of a sudden, the waves stopped. And it was smooth. And it was placid. The words there are a mega calm, a great calm. All of a sudden, everything was calm instantly, except for one thing. Can you think of what wasn't calm? The disciples. The disciples are now a little disturbed because they just saw all of this happen. This sudden deafening rain, also a deafening silence. For hours or however long it was, this water has been coming down on them and crashing, the waves crashing on them to the point where they don't think they're going to make it. And all of a sudden, everything's still. And they are more scared. They're more scared in their spirit than perhaps they were even of the water. And they say, who is this? Who is this? Because when you have miracles over healing, okay, that's kind of, that's a great thing, but it's kind of what the body does anyway. Okay, it's just kind of helping it along, right? If he's speaking to demons and telling them and casting them out and telling them to be silent, well, he can interact with them. But these are inanimate objects. This is waves and storm and rain, and he speaks to them and they listen as if they know who he is. And they say, who is this? Even the waves obey him. Now, I've heard it said, as an aside, and I think it's helpful, but I've heard it say, well, that if the Lord can calm the storms and the seas, that he can certainly calm the storms within me and within us. And I think that's very true. The Casting Crowns has that line in it, and it's a great line. And it is good for us to remember that the Lord can take care of all things. But a few notes about that. First of all, that the Lord doesn't always help us avoid the storm. That many times we have to go through the storm anyways. It's not like the disciples are sitting there with Jesus and then the storm goes around them. They are in the midst of the storm. And then Jesus calms the storm. So Jesus rebuking them, there's 3 rebukes there, by the way, if you paid attention. There's a rebuke of the disciples rebuking Jesus, and then Jesus rebukes the waves, and then Jesus rebukes his disciples. But there's a sense that we can have faith in God. We can have faith in Jesus because he can calm the storm. Not that he's going to always do that in every way that we think he should or every way we want him to. There's too many people out there saying, you know what, if you have Jesus, your life is going to go peachy keen and everything's going to be good and you're going to be wealthy and you're going to have everything you want. And that just plain isn't biblical. The Bible does not say that we're going to avoid the storms. The Bible says the Lord will take us through the storms. If you want to pin something on that, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It doesn't say God gave me a map around it. It says God is there with me as I walk through it. God will be with us, and we know that. So we may not miss a storm. We will be going through the storm, but God will take us through the storm. But the example that God can calm the storm within us, I think it's inadequate. I think it's biblical. I think it's helpful. But in this particular case, you don't get the sense of this, that the disciples are calm at the end. God, he hasn't calmed the storm within them. That's not really what's going on. And what it's trying to say is that Jesus is so powerful that we should, in a certain sense, be more afraid of him than we are of the storm. I think it's been said before that says, Jesus may be good, but he's anything but safe. He's anything but safe. Why? Because he's all powerful. Colossians 1:17 that says, in him all things hold together. The entire fabric of the universe basically holds together in Jesus. So if you understand that, and you understand and revere that about Jesus, you understand that the storm listens to Jesus because he has authority over all things, because all things have existence because of them. One of the things I think that's difficult is that we sang earlier, says if God is with us, who can be against us? But people too many times say, if God is with us, who can be against us? So like God is the most mighty of gods, and so he can take us through it. Well, okay. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It applies to this. It says so many times people look at it and say, well, if the opposite of black is white and the opposite of evil is good, the opposite of the devil is Michael the archangel. Because God is in a whole level all on his own. Nobody can do anything without God's permission. Michael can't do anything without God's permission. The devil, we see in Job, can't do anything without God's permission. One of the things that's difficult for us, as me as a preacher, as us as a Christian, is to understand then, why do bad things happen? But we can never say that bad things happen because God couldn't prevent them. Because God can always take us through those storms. He can still those storms both outside and inside. But if we understand and rightly fear our God in kind of a holy fear, in a righteous fear, in a loving fear, we understand something far beyond just having a God that can help us, be a good aid to us. Kind of come. That was one of the things that ancient gods a lot of times people had. And by the way, Freud did a study on this a number of years ago, and when he was studying, he said his explanation for why gods existed is he said, well, what happens is mankind, he wasn't a believer, needless to say, but he says mankind comes up with these fears, and so what they do is they say, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of bears, or I'm afraid of spiders, or rattlesnakes, or the water police or whatever it is you're afraid of, and you make a god to then help you through that. So I'm afraid I'm going to lose my crop, so then you pray to a god of fertility. I'm afraid that I'm going to lose the war, so you pray to a god of war. But the thing that's really weird about that Freud doesn't account for, is that in Christianity, we have a God that's scarier than anything he can save us from. Did you ever think about that? God is to be feared, not because he's evil, but because he is in control of all things. And that's both terrifying and wonderful at the same time. And what do I mean by that? They're terrified. The disciples are terrified over, who is this? Who is this person? Who is this? Human beings don't have ability to stop storms. And we say, yeah. Who is this person? And we say, well, it's not just any person, it's Jesus. And as we see God and we have that righteous fear of God, we can understand that he can not only take us through that, but that he will bring justice, that he can do all things, and that the storms that he calms within us are really just the beginning. That now we can be bold and go out into the storm and understand that we can go out and face those things. And we saw in the example of Paul that he has this encounter with Jesus. It's a real sense that Jesus actually exists in his life. He is Lord of his life. And what does he go out and do after that? He's unabashed, unafraid of anything. Why? Because he said, I'm more afraid of the Lord. And I love the Lord. And the Lord will take me through this. At his own pleasure, at his own will, he will see me through this. I can be bold. I do not need to fear men. I can be bold. I do not fear death. All these things that Paul talks about, all these things that the apostles do, is all stemming out of the fact that they now have encountered Jesus, not in his big hugginess. People bring Jesus out to that. Not that Jesus is like this really nice guy who had some good words. But Jesus is Lord. Not just, hey, we call him master, that's a good thing. Like you call me pastor, we call somebody else doctor, we call somebody else whatever. It's not just a title, it's an existence. And if we understand Jesus is Lord, then our fear of the world starts to fall away. And that's why Jesus says to them, why do you have no faith? Because if you had faith, if you knew who I was, if you truly understood who I was, you wouldn't fear the storm. Because storms will come in your life, and Jesus can be trusted to see you through it. But what you should know is just like those disciples, that there was a stilling of the storm, but at the end, they were still amidst fear. They still had a fear of who is this? Who is this that controls even the waves? And I love the fact that as the waves listen to him and hear him, that perhaps if the disciples truly understood him, perhaps if we truly understood him, then we would be stilled as well, that we would understand his authority. So to finish the story from earlier, this fellow he's over there, the water's lapping up there, and the electricity is jumping all around, and he hears this sudden hand on what he thinks is a door. Here's a big boom. He didn't know what that is. I don't know, maybe something popped. All of a sudden, he realizes there's a big hand on this one of those doors that has a window over it. And it sees a big hand go on it. It's a big glove and so forth. I don't know, maybe he did think it was the water police. They're going to turn off his water. He used too much water. I don't know. But it ends up being a fireman. And the fireman he reaches in and he undoes the window and he's pushing it over. And as he's coming in, the fellow says, don't step in the water because he'll be electrocuted. And so he gets through this window and he starts to pull himself over and he goes over to, there's this box here and it's kind of a breaker box and he takes a special fireman key. I don't know, there's probably a technical name for it, but he takes the key and he puts this in there, opens the box and he flips the switch and instantly all the water is ready to go for a dip because it has no more electricity. It's just water. It's just wet. There's nothing else that can harm him as he gets out through the water because the electricity has been turned off. And I like that example I both like it and don't like it, but I like it from the point of view, sense of the fear that they have, and all of a sudden, instantly, everything's safe, and everything's good. Everything's very wet for him, but everything's good, and he can get out of there. But what I don't like about that example is the sense that we can imagine that a fireman can do that and pull down with his hand and do something physical. But what the disciples had to face was that Jesus speaks to the storm, and it stops. We can't even understand that. We can't even begin to understand the raw power that Jesus has, that the power of God could instantly still this storm around them. So from that point of view, the illustration falls short. But we can be all that more amazed that if Jesus can still the storm, he can still the storms within us, but that we should still live with a healthy reverence, a healthy fear of who God is, and that we can serve a God that is awesome, a God that is majestic, a God that is beyond anything that we could create. That is our Jesus. And we still are amidst fear in our love of Jesus Christ. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this example of how we should be in awe of all the things that you can do. Not just in the sense of, as we sing in that song, that you're an awesome God, as if like somehow you're hunky-dory and you're great. Well, you are. But you are awesome in the sense that we are just our jaw-dropping amazedness at what you are and who you are. And we oftentimes forget that. And forgive us for that, Lord. I pray that we can come this week with the sense that you can do all things, that you can solve these problems in our life. Whether it be your will or not, we don't know. But we know that you can, and we can trust in you to get us through this storm, to get us through the valley of the shadow of death. Whatever situation we are running into our lives, you can help us through that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
And if you were able